Hello and welcome to That Bible Guy, where we answer your difficult questions on the Bible. I must confess I was doing a talk just a week and a half ago, and I was asked questions live through YouTube on Zoom, and I was just stuck for an answer. We get asked questions live, you have to think on the spot, and I just think trying to think so quickly meant I just couldn't really think of a good appropriate answer, and I was guilty of, I think, just waffling, to be honest. So I wanted to deal with that question now that I've had a few more minutes to think about it. Not that long. I posed it to myself and thought about it for about 20-30 minutes this morning, and I could make sense of the question more. So just to hold your hands up and say, you know what, we're not always going to have the best answers at the right time, but you know what, it's not about being right, and that's what I'm pleased about. It's about seeking the truth. That's why I got into this. That's what I want to do. It's not about being right. So here we are. The question was during this live session about what was special about the Bible was the New Testament. So 2 Timothy 3:16 says, all scripture is God-breathed, useful for teaching, correcting, rebuking, and training in righteousness. So it's all God-breathed. But a lot of the New Testament hadn't formed at the point that Paul had said this. So how do we know it refers to the rest of the New Testament? And again, I didn't really give a good answer for myself, really. I wasn't happy myself thinking about this. I hadn't heard that question like that before. So Paul wrote to Timothy in about AD 65. So it is true to say at that point, the New Testament hadn't really formed. It wasn't finalized. We didn't have a true canon at that point. So how do we know it talks about the rest of the New Testament? Excuse me. There's a few things to say to that. The first thing to say on what Paul was saying here, knowing he himself knew that, this was being written down, the letter to Timothy, but lots of it hadn't been written down, was in his mind anyway. I believe he was also thinking of the Old Testament. He was thinking of everything that had gone before, and that was God-breathed. The prophecies, the writings of the Old Testament were God-breathed. The second and very important thing to say is Paul was a companion of Peter and knew all the other apostles. He had spent time with the other apostles and the other writers of the New Testament. Peter, again, John, Mark, Matthew, the other gospel writers. Paul knew these men and had spent time with these men, and had also being involved in the same events that these gospel writers and other writers wrote about. So to say that it was God-breathed, in my opinion, Paul was also talking about the writings that were forming around the time that he was writing. So maybe they hadn't formally came together in the New Testament. He had presided over and watched the events that these writers ended up writing about when they completed the New Testament. Writers like John of Revelation and the Gospel of John, and also Matthew, Mark, and the other Gospels, which were written down just after this, potentially. So Paul had been privy to these events. He knew what they were going to write about, possibly before they were written, or even when they were written, but just hadn't been formally gathered together at this point. So in my mind, what Paul was in Paul's mind was what would be written later anyway. Is the second thing to say. The third thing to say in 2 Peter 3 verse 15, Peter himself recognized Paul's writings as being directed by God. 2 Peter 3 verse 15, you'll see the scripture there. It talks about Peter, identifying Paul's writings as being from God. So Peter recognized Paul recognized Peter. They were obviously companions at one time or another and knew about what they were going to write about. The fourth thing to say is the process of canonization itself was inspired. So how the books came to be formed and what was decided upon to be part of our New Testament. So as I said before, it was Eusebius had decided and talked about what books were decided upon to form the canon. And it wasn't like they sat down and had a formal process, but these books were arrived at because they were of apostolic authority. That's what gave them credence. God worked through the apostles. The theological consistency. So they were all consistent with one another, and they were being used in the churches because they were recognized as apostolic, because they were recognized as being divinely inspired. So they started to be used. So this process with these books maybe later on were formed as part of our New Testament were already being recognized and starting to be used anyway. So the process of canonization itself was seen by Paul. He wrote 2 Timothy 3:16 as being an inspired process. So you've got to trust in the process of canonization. So I've kind of dealt with some of the mechanics of the question of how can we know that it refers to the rest of the New Testament. When Paul says Scripture's God breathed and inspired, well, what about the rest? Well, there's something to say here. The proof of inspiration comes not because of the Scripture. And if we claim the Bible is inspired because the Scripture says so, it's kind of circular reasoning, to be honest. To say, oh, well, the Bible's inspired because Paul says it's inspired. I don't trust the Bible's inspired because it says it's inspired. Obviously I do believe that when he says it's inspired, that's correct. But it's inspired because, again, they demonstrated themselves. The writings demonstrated apostolic authority, usage in the churches, theological consistency, no mistakes, no flaws, carefully written down in such a manner that they demonstrated themselves to be inspired. And the other factor as well, why are these writings inspired? Well, the Bible proves itself to be inspired because of fulfilled prophecies, predicted events that take place, because of the workings of miracles, where they were written down about the event which took place in front of many thousands of people very often. The eyewitness testimony to the events themselves being written down and recorded the way they were is another evidence of inspiration. It's from God. And also the events like the resurrection. So to say, well, how do we know the rest is inspired? Because it may only be talking about what was written at that point in time. We don't just accept the Bible and them writings to be inspired just because Paul said they were inspired. In other words, that would be demonstrating proof by circularly. It wouldn't really work. So we believe they're inspired not because it just says so, but because of the evidence of the works themselves. So just clarifying, Paul in my mind was thinking about what had gone before, but due to being a companion of the other writers and privy to the events, he was referring to what also will be written down later. And Peter demonstrates that he trusted in the writings of Paul, as Paul did of Peter, who came in some of the writings were slightly later. The fourth thing is the process of canonization itself demonstrated inspiration anyway. And the last thing is we don't need the Bible to tell us inspired. It demonstrates itself. It's inspired. And we don't use 2 Timothy 3:16 to prove that the Bible is inspired just because it says it is. It demonstrates it itself through its writings and all the evidence that goes with that. So that's me dealing with that question. I think there was many other questions as well. Lots of food for thought in there. If you have any thoughts on this, please let me know. Thanks to some of the brothers that also stepped in at the time and maybe answered that question. And brother Paul, who sent me some emails even since that time with his thoughts on it. Really, really helpful. I love digging in, seeking the truth. Again, remember, it's not about being right and having no mistakes, having no flaws in us. We all need God's help. Hope this has helped us today. If it has, please hit the like button on the video and share it on for other people. Please subscribe, as you always do, to that Bible guide, which is so helpful. If you'll be so inclined, you can see my Patreon videos as well and support the ministry and developing and growing ministry. But I look forward to dealing with some other questions that come my way. There are many weird and wonderful questions. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and let's get his word out there.